Hello there. So today I'd like to talk about the impact of long-term thought processes and decision making versus the short term. Now, the thing is, when you think about things in the long term, it tends to change your overall thought process for the better. Makes you feel more secure, knowing that you have some sort of long-term goal. You tend to accomplish things over time that you might not have thought you could in the short term. When you think about things day to day or week to week, most things can seem impossible. It can seem really difficult to get anywhere in life, and it can seem really difficult to do anything. But when you think about life in the long run, when you think about life in the 5 to 10 year time span or lifetime time span, things start to get more plausible. You start to think, well, if this is really worth doing, I can do it in this amount of time. And, it's plausible. And I'd say even pretty amazing goals can be set at that time scale if that's your objective, if you want to really push yourself. Now, personally, a lot of my goals have been really simple. I, have seen that, as a younger man, I saw myself wasting a lot of time thinking about, and going after short term enjoyment and suffering in the long term. Earning money in the short term, but hating it in the long term and feeling trapped. Golden handcuffs, being stuck in a thing I didn't want to do. Not being able to afford housing in the long run because I spent my money in stupid ways, or messing up my body so that I couldn't easily build a home for myself because of the same reasons. And the thing is, I think human beings tend to avoid things that are difficult by nature. If we see something that's hard, we run the other way because we don't like to push too hard. We have this ancestry that struggled to feed itself, an ancestry that already had enough to deal with. And for many of us, that ancestry goes up to this generation or the previous generation. And so thinking about ways to make our lives harder so that we can have something in the long run, it's just not practical to most of us in our mindset day to day. The thing is that this tends to induce panic-based decision making. So instead of thinking about things on a long-term scale, when you encounter a problem, you think very short-term. I just need to solve this problem, that problem. I just need to get from A to B. And it's always like that. It's always kind of rushed, kind of split-second decision making, and it permeates everything. You'll be walking through the grocery store and make an impulsive purchase, or be online and make an impulsive purchase of something you didn't need because you've already kind of wired your mind to make split-second rushed decisions that don't involve a lot of actual thought. The thing is, with this panic-based decision making, again, we're pursuing a lot more of those short-term enjoyment without the long-term enjoyment, and a lot more long-term pain. And this is a common theme a lot of people will talk about, is that if you focus on short-term things that are difficult, in the long run, you'll get better enjoyment out of it. So that kind of plays into finances. So one thing I've thought about a lot recently is how the way I live, and me and my partner live, is pretty affordable, pretty basic, pretty cheap. Even if we didn't happen to be lucky and have this piece of land to stay on right now, we got other land, and we could live very cheaply and affordably. And the land that I have access to, it involved saving up money for several months and having nothing. I mean, barely eating, just suffering a little bit, because I knew I had my eye on that long-term goal that if I save like this, if I really push us and I minimize our expenses, we can buy a piece of land. And we did it quick. It didn't take a whole lot. And that also plays into, how we're living now. I often say, we could live anywhere like this because our lifestyle is so much more affordable than those that are, bound to somebody else's thought process of how you're supposed to live. So one thing I saw was, every affordability calculator is based on a two-bedroom apartment. You can afford to live in a two-bedroom apartment if you, in a city, if you make X amount of money. How many people are even looking at a 2-bedroom apartment right now? Most of the people that are desperate for housing are looking at even a studio right now. Any kind of roof over their head that's theirs. I think most people don't want to have roommates. And the fact that that's the norm now is kind of crappy, that we all have to live in these like giant tenement houses, you know. But to say, oh, I have to have a 2-bedroom, and I have to have a kid, and I have to have a TV. Not a lot of people care about TV, but I got to have a good smartphone, and I got to have, unlimited data, and I got to have all this stuff, right? And it sounds cliche to talk about the latest smartphone and stuff, but I encourage anyone to examine their habits realistically, right? And I'm sure many of you are totally realistic and don't really care about that stuff. This video is being recorded right now on a Pixel 4, which is we're on like the Pixel 8 now or something. Several years old. It's dated. It really kind of needs to be replaced, or at least the battery needs to be replaced. But it works fine. I have no issues with it. I don't use it for much. I don't need it for much. That's kind of the thing, is separating needs from wants, and it can be really difficult to do that, because I think when I hear somebody else talk about what they need, when I'm talking to them about the idea of, for example, doing this, they'll say, oh, I can't live off grid. There's no way. Or I can't live out in the country. I want to have a homestead. I want land. I want all these things, but I just can't do it. There's no way, because I need this and this and this and this. And those things are always like, well, do you really need that right now? Can you live without it for a period of time even, so that you can have it later and have it more in a more stable way? And that's always kind of how I think about it, right? So the idea of paying rent, for example, extremely unsustainable. Is your plan to be generating income until the day you die? So if your plan is to rent till you die, then you have to generate income till you die. You're going to get older. You're going to get sicker. You're going to have a hard time. You might be lucky and just drop dead perfectly healthy, but most likely, you get older, things get harder, and you're still going to be stuck working. And then you're really suffering. It's almost like paying interest on money you borrowed against your own life. And that's really, credit cards, it's all the same principle. It's spending in the short term and suffering in the long term. And so I decided at some point a while back that I was never going to rent again. The only rent I pay is a work trade. And, I don't live in the most practical location. And there's other costs associated with this life, like vehicle maintenance. And I think about that in the long term, and I don't like it. It's not my favorite thing. But it was all about sorting between what the best options are right now and making the best long-term decision of something that's sustainable. And that often stops me from doing certain things. A lot of things I just won't do, and I'll say, oh, it's too difficult, too much effort, and people think I'm lazy, but the reality is it's not worth it in the long term. I see the long-term outcome of this decision, and it's not worth it. Likewise, there are things I don't want to do sometimes that are worth it in the short term, or in the long term, for the short-term suffering. Example, I'm taking a job that doesn't pay very much right now, because not only does it get me in the door of the community that I want to be a part of in the local area, and talking to people who are smart about this stuff, learning from them, but it gets me income to pay off debts, save money, and invest. And I don't need that income, really. I could continue relying on Caitlin, relying on my family, whatever, but that's not a long-term sustainable plan, so we don't think that way. But these are all things you have to think about, and ways that you have to approach life. Work is terrible if you don't have a goal. Work sucks if you don't have a goal. It's not worth it, because what are you doing it for? What's the purpose of going to work every day? It makes you depressed. If you have a goal, you keep your eyes on that goal, and every day you go to work, it's a little bit easier to struggle. It's a little bit easier for the boss to berate you or whatever. And I think in the long run, the way I think about it is, work is meant to be, if you do have a job, it's meant to be that you invest that money into things that will eventually make you money down the line. Don't be spending all that money on rent. Even if that means you got to live in a van. If you want to live close to a major city and take a major city job, that major city job likely pays you better. Otherwise, what are you doing there? And you're going to have all this extra income that you're not spending on your $3,000-$4,000 rent. That $3,000-$4,000 rent, you save that up for a couple years, you've got a nice piece of land. You save it up for a couple more years, you've turned your van on your nice piece of land into a house. It really is. I mean, it sounds unrealistic, right? But I've done this, and I'm a millennial, and I'm not wealthy, and I wasn't born into wealth. In fact, I was born into a pretty, I would say, lower middle class and dropped down to lower class as an adult. So I understand. I've made minimum wage, I've worked minimum wage, and I know what it's like. Right now, this job I have accepted, it's below minimum wage in my state. But I see it as an opportunity in so many different ways that it makes it worth it. But I would say biggest thing I can promote to anybody trying to get into changing their life in this way is just look at your habits and look at the things that you own and want and determine how you can minimize that stuff. How can you reduce your expenses? If you don't want to think in the long term, if you just want to enjoy yourself in the short term, it's easier. It's way easier to do that. But I've realized after I hit 30 that I was probably going to live to hit 40 and possibly 50 and possibly 60. And so I had to start thinking that way. You know, when I was in my 20s, I didn't think I was going to live to be 30. In fact, I was certain I was going to die before I was 30. And then after I gave up on that idea, I was like, I'm going to be retired by the time I'm 35. But I didn't think about it that way. I didn't think I would actually get retired by the time I was 35. And now I kind of think, you know, retirement, it sounds kind of boring, you know? I want to do something. I just don't want to have to work so hard all the time and making money my number one priority in life. And so that's how I approach it now. But I've minimized what I need. We live in a 160 square foot shack on a piece of land that we don't have to pay rent for. We work trade for it right now. And everything is minimized. Everything is simplified to the absolute most that it can be. Our food budget is around $300 a month, and sometimes we, you know, eat at my family's house or eat at friends' houses. But in general, our food budget is $300 a month. And we're able to live off that. Two people are able to live off that. And we don't eat poorly. We eat a lot of vegetables and a lot of fruits. We eat healthy. So it can be done. And it's all about your thought process. Pain can have a big impact. I understand this. I live with the aftermath of 2 herniated discs and laminectomies and a hole in my spine that developed after those and all kinds of crap. I totally understand that pain can screw up your thought process. But the recommendation there is still the same. Do what you need to do in the long term. Don't live with this idea you're going to die tomorrow. Live with the idea that, you know, most likely you're going to keep living, and you don't want to live with the results of not doing anything to try and make the problem better in a year or 5 years or 10 years. It's always about the long term. Now let's talk about investing a little bit. The thing about investing is, again, people have this tendency to think in the short term. That's why people like to invest in cryptocurrency. They like to do like kind of a day trading kind of game. That's how they think about investing, because I'm rushing to make more money. I got to scramble and make more money. And I got to get to my goals tomorrow. I can't get to them in 5 years. It's got to be tomorrow. I'm going to die in 5 years. I better get to my goals tomorrow, you know. And it's not going to happen, most likely. Your chances of success are very low. You're taking a huge risk. Personally, I don't like that kind of gambling. I'm okay with risk. I just don't like to gamble. I like to have some chance of success. And so that's how I think about it, is, you know, what is my actual long-term chance of success here, and how likely is it that this plan is going to work out? So, you know, you do long-term investment strategies. You think about what is the long-term trajectory. Like if you're going to buy a stock, think about the long-term trajectory of that stock, not what is, you know, going to happen tomorrow. Because if you're focusing all the time on what's going to happen tomorrow, you're always going to find yourself on the bad end of every deal. You're always going to find that somebody else is thinking ahead a little bit farther than you are, and you get screwed. That's just the reality. And, you know, there's a lot of situations that are very difficult, like housing, real expensive, really challenging. You can't there's no way to afford it with a regular job for most people. So you got to look at alternatives. Again, it's a lot of it, I think, is you have to kind of pick your own path. And most people won't do this. It's just not common to pick your own path. Most people, they see what everybody else is doing. We're social creatures and they want to copy what everyone else is doing. That's the easiest thing to do. So what people do, they get a job, they struggle to survive, and they have kids way too young, way before they're ready. And those kids grow up in an unstable household, probably a divorce. The kids are traumatized. They got no money. It's a cycle of poverty. It's consumerism at its finest, right? Having kids is an act of consumption if you're not ready for it. It's not an act of, it's not a noble act to have children if you're not ready. It's an act of consumption. You trying to fill a void that somebody else was doing something and you felt like you had to do it at the same time as them. You didn't have the patience to wait. So that's kind of it. I mean, basically, you got to think in the long term. Stretch out your perspective. Don't think about tomorrow so much. Don't think about next week. And stop living paycheck to paycheck. Stop spending your money. There's almost always something that people are overdoing and screwing themselves. And I get it. I understand the boomers are all telling us if we just didn't buy avocado toast, that would fix everything, right? But it's partly true. The thing is, just because they had it easier than you doesn't mean that you now get to complain and not try to do anything about your situation. That's their problem. The boomers, most of them didn't invest very well. And so the ones that don't have pensions, which is the majority, and didn't invest, are now just as screwed as everybody else. They're now all trying to figure out housing all of a sudden, just dumped out onto the street. A lot of them did stupid things like get reverse mortgages too and ended up not having the money to keep their homes. There's a lot of things that didn't work out for them too. And ultimately they're full of preservatives and chemicals. So, very toxic chemicals that are going to give them horrible health problems. So if you want to poo-poo what everybody else is doing and focus on that as your problem, you're never going to get anywhere because you're externalizing the problem. What you need to do, and this is going to sound cliche, is you got to look within. You got to see, okay, what's around me? What do I have access to from here? And what can I do with it? What are my options? How can I push forward in this situation? And how can I make things better from where I am now? And if you think in the long term, it also increases your environmental consciousness. I don't want to hear this idea from anyone spouting anti-consumer, pro-environmental consciousness if you're thinking only about tomorrow. If all you care about is that you're fed tonight and you have a bedroom to sleep in tomorrow, it doesn't make sense for you to talk about how everyone else is consuming, conspicuously, because you're doing the same thing. You're not going to think about the long term of the planet if you're not thinking about the long term of your life. When I consider sustainability and long term impacts of what I'm doing, I think about it in my life first, and then that extends out to everywhere else. Because if I screw up the planet, if I contribute to screwing up the planet, and if everybody does that, then we all have a crappy later life. And so, when I'm developing a piece of land, I'm very careful about what trees do I cut, what area do I clear, and honestly, what climate do I live in? This ain't my favorite climate. You know why? Because the growing season's so short, you can hardly grow food. So what? You're going to spend your whole life buying canning jars and eating preserved food for 6 months or 8 months out of the year? It doesn't sound practical. And winters are so unstable, you really struggle to get a garden in because things are just not consistent. So you have to invest in a bunch of plastic and you have to spend a bunch of energy to heat and all this stuff. And it's not long-term sustainable. It never will be. And so you really got to think about that. Like, if I'm doing exactly what I'm doing today in 10 years, what is that going to mean? And the thing is, you might also be prone to say, well, you know what, I'll just do it today and I'll stop tomorrow. But that, in and of itself, you need to hack that mindset and say, really, what is this going to do? This YouTube channel, it's got, 200-something views, 200-something subscribers right now. If I thought in short term I never would have gotten this thing off the ground, and I'm hoping someday it develops, but it's not a guarantee. And you know, I've had to go this long, I've had to go multiple years without making a penny off of it. And so I'm really just dumping effort into something that so far hasn't made me any money. So I don't think about it in the long, you know, in the short term. It's all in the long term. Same with this move. I thought, well, where I'm at is experiencing drought. I don't want to live where there's a drought, and there's going to be more drought with time. That doesn't sound economically viable. Things are going to get tougher. So I'm going to go somewhere a little bit more sustainable. It's not where I want to end. It's not where I want to stop. But I just thought, you know what? Let me move up the ladder to somewhere a little more sustainable. Let me move somewhere where there's a little more economic opportunity. It ain't perfect. It ain't where I want to be my whole life, but it's a little bit better. And I think that's the kind of mindset shift that happens when you think in the long term. You go from, I'm just trying to get by, I just need this, I just need that, to what is going to happen in 20 years if I'm doing what I do today. So that's my appeal to anyone watching this. You know, try not to distract yourself with nonsense. Try to focus on goals and think about the long term. But anyway, if you have any questions or comments or topics, put them in the comments. Like, subscribe, share it out, and donate on Patreon if you have the extra cash to do so, because I could sure use it. Anyway, have a great day, y'all. Thanks for watching. Bye now.